In a single day and night of misfortune, it sank into the ocean. That sentence, written nearly 2,400 years ago, launched the greatest treasure hunt in human history. Explorers, scholars, pirates, and dreamers have searched for the lost city ever since. From the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, from the coasts of Spain to the shores of Antarctica, expeditions have spent fortunes chasing shadows on the seafloor. The story of Atlantis has outlasted empires. It has survived the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance. It has been reimagined by poets, philosophers, and Hollywood screenwriters. And despite centuries of searching, the city has never been found. But here is what gets lost in the retellings. Atlantis is not a folk legend. It is not a myth passed down through generations of sailors. The story of Atlantis comes from exactly one source, one man. One philosopher writing in Athens around 360 BC. His name was Plato, and what he described was not a bedtime story. He gave specific measurements, specific geography, a specific timeline. He named the ocean where it sank. He described the rings of water and land that surrounded its central city. He explained how this civilization conquered parts of Western Europe and Africa before the gods destroyed it. Plato claimed he received this account from the Athenian statesman Solon, who had traveled to Egypt around 600 BC and learned the story from priests in the city of Sais. Those priests, Plato wrote, had records going back 9,000 years. They told Solon that the Greeks were like children compared to the Egyptians, that Greek memory was short, and that great civilizations had risen and fallen long before Athens existed. This is a critical detail that gets buried in modern retellings. Plato did not claim to have invented this story. He claimed it came from Egyptian temple records, passed through Solon, then through Solon's relative Dropides, then through Critias the Elder, and finally to Critias the Younger, who narrates the tale in the dialogues. 4 generations of transmission. Whether that chain of custody makes the story more credible or less depends entirely on whether you believe Plato was telling the truth. So the question is simple. Was Plato describing a real place that existed before recorded history, or was he inventing a philosophical allegory to make a point about hubris and divine punishment? The answer to that question has eluded humanity for 24 centuries, and the debate shows no sign of ending. Plato wrote about Atlantis in 2 dialogues. The first is called Timaeus, the second is Critias. Both were written near the end of his life, when Plato was in his 70s and considered one of the greatest minds in the Greek world. In Timaeus, an Egyptian priest tells Solon about a powerful island nation that existed 9,000 years before their conversation. The priest describes how this nation, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, commanded a massive military force. They conquered Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Then Athens stood against them. The Athenians defeated the Atlantean forces, and shortly after that victory, catastrophe struck. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, the entire island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea and vanished. In Critias, Plato provides far more detail. He describes Atlantis as a rectangular island measuring roughly 340 miles by 230 miles. At its center stood a mountain where the god Poseidon had placed his mortal wife Cleito. To protect her, Poseidon carved the land into concentric rings of water and earth, creating natural barriers that made the central island nearly impenetrable. The Atlanteans built elaborate infrastructure over generations. They cut a canal 300 feet wide from the sea to the outermost ring, allowing ships to sail directly into the heart of their capital. They constructed bridges between the rings, wide enough for a chariot to pass. They dug tunnels beneath the water channels so ships could sail through without interruption. They covered the outer wall with brass, the inner wall with tin, and the wall surrounding the Acropolis itself with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as gleaming like fire and more precious than anything except gold. The central island contained the palace of the kings, descended from Poseidon through 10 generations. The temple to Poseidon was 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, and proportionately tall. Inside stood a golden statue of the god driving a chariot with 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 Nereids riding dolphins. The entire temple was faced with silver and its pinnacles with gold. Beyond the temple lay hot and cold springs, gardens, race courses for horses, gymnasiums, and harbors filled with triremes returning from every corner of the known world. The entire civilization was wealthy beyond imagination. They had forests of every kind of tree. They had elephants in abundance. The fruit trees produced so generously that the land itself seemed blessed by the gods. Then they grew arrogant. The divine portion of their nature began to fade. They became filled with greed and power, and Zeus, seeing their corruption, gathered the gods to determine their punishment. The Critias dialogue ends abruptly, mid-sentence. Plato never finished it. We never hear what Zeus decreed. We only know from Timaeus that Atlantis sank. Now, Plato's most famous student was a man named Aristotle, and Aristotle had no patience for this story. He reportedly said that Plato invented Atlantis, and that he alone could sink what he alone had raised. In other words, Aristotle believed Atlantis was fiction, a philosophical device Plato created to illustrate moral decay. Many scholars agree. They point out that Plato used fictional settings in other dialogues. The Republic describes an ideal city that never existed. Why should Atlantis be different? But others are not so certain, because Plato's descriptions contain specific measurements, specific locations, a specific timeline. Why would a philosopher inventing a moral allegory bother with such precise details? Why describe the width of canals in feet? Why specify that the island lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules? This tension between allegory and history has driven the search for Atlantis ever since. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because over the past century, researchers have identified locations that match portions of Plato's description with unsettling accuracy. The strongest candidate is Santorini, also known as Thera, a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BC, one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history destroyed the Minoan civilization that flourished there. Geologists estimate the explosion was 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa. The caldera collapse sank most of the island, leaving only the crescent-shaped remnant we see today. Tsunamis devastated Crete, 70 miles to the south. Ash fell as far as Egypt and Turkey. An entire Bronze Age culture that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries vanished in what may have been a single day. The timing is wrong by about 7,000 years, Plato said. Atlantis sank 9,000 years before Solon's visit, which would place the catastrophe around 9,600 BC. But some scholars believe the Egyptian priests confused their units, perhaps mistranslating months for years. 900 years would fit the Minoan collapse perfectly. The Minoans had concentric harbors at their capital of Akrotiri. They were a naval power with colonies across the Aegean. They traded with Egypt, which would explain how the story reached Egyptian priests. And they were destroyed suddenly by forces beyond their control. Recent excavations at Akrotiri have revealed a sophisticated city buried beneath volcanic ash, preserved like Pompeii, multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing, elaborate frescoes depicting ships, dolphins, and religious ceremonies, a civilization that vanished at the height of its power. Then there is the Richat structure in Mauritania, a circular formation in the Sahara Desert that measures roughly 30 miles across. From above, it appears as concentric rings, eerily similar to Plato's description. Some researchers believe the Sahara was once green, fed by rivers that have since dried up. If Atlantis existed when the Sahara was fertile, the Richat structure would have been coastal. The problem is obvious. It is landlocked today. No ocean anywhere near it. In 2001, a Canadian exploration company using side-scan sonar detected stone structures at 2,000 feet depth off the coast of Cuba. The formations appeared to be streets, pyramids, and buildings covering an area roughly the size of a small city. The discovery made international headlines, but follow-up expeditions were never completed. The structures remain unverified. Closer to Plato's description is Spartel Island, a submerged seamount in the Strait of Gibraltar, exactly where Plato placed Atlantis. Core samples show it was above water until around 9000 BC, when rising sea levels from melting glaciers submerged it. The timing matches Plato's account almost exactly. But the island was small, nothing like the massive civilization Plato described. And then there is Doggerland, the land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Until about 8000 BC, this was dry land. Mammoth hunters walked from England to France. Then the Ice Age ended, the sea rose, and Doggerland drowned. Today it lies beneath the North Sea, occasionally yielding mammoth bones and stone tools to fishing trawlers. None of these candidates are perfect. Each matches some details and contradicts others. The search continues. But while Atlantis remains elusive, something else has become undeniable. Cities have sunk beneath the ocean. This is not legend. This is archaeology, and the evidence lies on seafloors around the world. In the Gulf of Khambat, off the coast of Gujarat, India, sonar surveys have detected the submerged ruins of Dwarka, a city mentioned in ancient Sanskrit texts as the kingdom of Lord Krishna. The structures lie at 120 feet depth, spread across several miles. Carbon dating of artifacts suggests occupation around 1500 BC, though some researchers believe the site is far older. Ancient texts describe Dwarka as a prosperous port with palaces, temples, and a planned grid of streets. The city appears to have been swallowed by the sea, exactly as the legends claim. Port Royal, Jamaica, was once called the wickedest city on earth, a haven for privateers and buccaneers who raided Spanish treasure fleets. On the 7th of June, 1692, at approximately 11:40 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck. The sandy soil beneath the city liquefied. Two-thirds of Port Royal slid into the Caribbean in a matter of minutes. Buildings sank to their rooftops. Streets became underwater canyons. 2,000 people died instantly, many entombed in their own homes. Survivors described watching the ground open and swallow entire blocks. Today, divers explore the submerged streets, finding intact buildings, wine bottles still corked, pewter plates set for meals never eaten, and shipwrecks trapped between sunken warehouses. Port Royal is one of the most significant underwater archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. Off the southern coast of Greece lies Pavlopetri, the oldest submerged city ever discovered. It is 5,000 years old, contemporary with the first pyramids of Egypt. Bronze Age streets and buildings rest beneath 15 feet of water, so close to shore that you can see them on calm days. Archaeologists have mapped the entire city plan using sonar and underwater photography without removing a single stone. They found evidence of a textile industry, suggesting trade networks that stretched across the ancient Mediterranean. And perhaps most spectacular is Thonis Heracleion, once the greatest port in Egypt. For centuries, historians thought it was a myth mentioned in ancient texts but never found. Then in the year 2000, a French archaeologist named Franck Gaudio discovered it beneath 30 feet of water in the Bay of Aboukir. The city had slipped into the Mediterranean around 800 AD, likely due to earthquakes and rising sea levels. Massive statues, temple walls, and hundreds of ships lay perfectly preserved in the silt. These are not legends. These are real cities, real civilizations, real people who woke up one day and watched their homes slide into the sea. The concept of Atlantis, a great civilization destroyed by the ocean, is not fantasy. It has happened, multiple times, in multiple places, within recorded history. So what does Atlantis mean? Perhaps Plato was describing a real place, distorted through 9,000 years of oral tradition until the details blurred into myth. Perhaps the Egyptian priests confused multiple stories, multiple floods, multiple lost cities into a single narrative. Or perhaps Plato understood something about human nature that we prefer not to admit. Civilizations rise. They grow wealthy and powerful. They begin to believe they are invincible. And then the earth shakes, the water rises, and everything they built vanishes in a single day and night of misfortune. The ocean does not negotiate. It does not respect monuments or walls or the achievements of great nations. The sea takes what it wants, and sometimes what it takes never comes back. Atlantis may never be found, but the warning it carries echoes across every generation. Empires fall, coastlines shift, the water is patient, and the floor of the ocean is crowded with cities that believed they would last forever.